We've been talking for a while now about switching to Linux, and I also recommend, though, switching slowly so that you do not overwhelm yourself with a number of different changes. So one of the best ways to try out Linux is to just pick yourself up a spare USB drive, which are as little now as like $10. In fact, I did just recently buy one. I'm going to rebuild one of my production systems. This is a 64 gigabyte USB 3.2, and I paid $10 for it. We're going to show you today how you can install Linux onto this USB drive without changing your main computer, so you can keep using that and then switch over to Linux when you want to play around with that a little bit more. So stay tuned. Thanks for checking out this Switched to Linux video. If you've not already subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so today. Leave us some likes and some comments down below, as that helps us in the algorithm. So today we are going to talk about installing Linux on real hardware with a USB drive. Now, I want to talk about a few things in the beginning here, and we have some videos about these general threads. So first, let's talk about Persistence, because we're talking about installing on something like a USB drive like the SanDisk here. Now, people talk about Persistence. What is Persistence? Well, Persistence is when you have a live key where the underlying operating system on the drive isn't changing, but there are files where you can save your folders, and in some cases, applications you install and other tools onto your drive. We're not talking about that. That is antiquated. Linux can run entirely as a full-fledged operating system on a USB drive. There's no reason to use the Persistence model outside of specialized cases like Tails, where they're really looking at the privacy, the anonymity model, and the operating system itself rolls as a uniform clump every 6 weeks. We're talking about installing Linux just like you would install any other operating system on your computer. That's what we're talking about. That's the area that we are getting into. Now, we are also going to be installing this without impacting your computer or your existing drive. So it is very possible, even in the installer we're working with here today, it is possible for you to install alongside. What that means is one single disk in your computer, the installer's going to take the drive, it's going to cut it down, it's going to put half of it and install Linux on it. It's going to keep your existing Windows, and then the opening part, it's going to rewrite instead of the Windows boot manager, it's going to install the Grub Linux boot manager, because that Linux boot manager called Grub, or whatever other install manager you're doing here, this will say, hey, do you want to boot into Windows? Do you want to boot into Linux? It gives you that choice. Whereas the Windows bootloader doesn't care about Linux. It doesn't even see Linux. It just says, oh, Windows, you want to boot into that? Of course, because Windows is that way. So the problem with doing an alongside is if you do a Windows update and Windows updates that boot sector, you're going to wipe out Grub and you won't be able to boot into your Linux system anymore. But what we're going to do is we're going to put our Linux on one drive. We're going to put our Windows on our other drive, or pretty much just leave that alone. And then you go into your BIOS and you can do one of two things. One method you can do is you can just go ahead and use the one-time boot menu to choose which disk you're booting from, or you can set your BIOS to check for a USB drive first. If there's a USB drive, boot that first. If there's not a USB drive, it boots right into Windows. So you can automate the process as well. I'm going to show you how to do that, but you can do it either way you want. Now, I use this application, for example, on my one laptop where I have 2 internal hard drives. One of those runs Linux Mint, which is the default, and the other one runs Cubes, which I have to get to with that one-time boot menu. And I don't ask it which one it wants to go to for security reasons. So we're going to be walking through all of the steps of installing Linux on a separate drive, so you can play around with Linux, you can test how everything works, and you can take care of all of that without impacting the Windows computer. So when it comes down to work, you're going to get right on in and be able to keep working on Windows. But when your work is done, it's time to experiment, see what you can do, play, surf the web, do whatever else. You're going to want to switch over to this drive. Now, I will say this also. Don't rely on this permanently. These USB drives, if you're using it as a regular operating system, you have probably about 2 years because of the constant rewrites. It will kill that USB drive. Now, if you were to go out and you were to buy, let's say, an external hard drive like this, this is a Western Digital Easy Store. This guy here is a full-fledged hard drive. These will last way longer. You could just as easily install it onto this, run this whenever you plug it in, unplug this when you don't want to run Linux, and you'll have a much better solution. This is good as well, but these are also $100, $200 depending on the size you want. Whereas this little guy that you can play with Linux is $10. So that's why we're going to do it with the cheaper alternative now, because I don't want you to spend a ton of money to test out Linux, but nevertheless we want to do that. So just summarizing what our video is going to have here, we're going to talk about a little bit about installing or creating your installation media. Now, we have also done this on previous videos a number of times, and I'm going to try and clip as long as I can do it in a good format, we're going to clip out what we did doing the same exact thing on Windows already. But today's case, I'm going to do it from a Linux computer because that's what I have handy. So you have those two options. Once we get that installation media, we're actually going to go into real hardware and we're going to work around an existing disk so that we don't mess up that operating system. And then we're going to show you by the end that we have successfully install this without messing up that particular operating system. So that is our roadmap for this. So with that, we're going to shut off this camera and we're going to go right on over to various desktops so we can have a look at what is going on. So once again, thank you guys for coming along. Subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so, and let's get on into the process now. For our installation, we're going to run MX Linux because it's going to work better. I'll explain why in a few minutes. We're going to download the basic XFCE desktop, which I've already done here, and I'm going to do an SHA sum, and you can go ahead and have a look at the other videos about how we did that on Windows. But just briefly here, I'm grabbing the signatures for the files and then just find the correct file that we've downloaded. So I'm highlighting the part here, the 5C18 CFA. This is the checksum that we get, and just doing a visual comparison of a few different sections. You'll notice that this all verifies perfectly fine. So our download is correct. You do want to do this verification step each time you're downloading software. Here on Linux Mint, I'm just going to go ahead and use the USB image writer to write the drive onto the USB drive that I want to install. Well, I plugged my drive in, got some extra stuff going up there. So let's go ahead and grab our USB image writer. And then we're going to select the ISO that we are going to use, which is going to be the MX Linux 23.3 in this case. And we're going to select to install it onto our USB drive. Hit the right button and then enter your password here. And then we just need to wait for this to finish. Should take about, 5 or so minutes, maybe a few minutes less. Now, before we get into the actual install, I'm going to show you this step over on Windows now. Although we're going to be using a different distribution, I'm just going to show you a little bit about what that's going to look like on Windows for this step, assuming you don't already have Linux running. So we're going to go ahead and pull up a web browser, and we're going to go to linuxmint.com. And as we go to linuxmint.com, there's going to be a couple of options. So when linuxmint.com opens up, you will have a few different options. Now, the recommended is 21.3, and I would recommend that for most people. That one does work really well. I'm going to use LMDE6, and LMDE6 is a Linux Mint based on Debian instead of Ubuntu. And really the only reason I'm going with that on this particular build is because this one is going to give me the ability to have it based on Debian. It doesn't update as much. It doesn't roll as much. And since this computer is going to somebody that completely abhors all updates, I'm going to go ahead and just use this edition because it's going to have a little bit better options. Now, to save time, and I'm on a very slow internet connection, I have already downloaded the distribution, but I have not yet verified it. And it is very important that you verify your distributions. So over here, you can see the integrity and authenticity, and then they have a verify button here. This is going to be the step that some people are going to glaze over and be like, I don't know what any of that means. Let me actually pull this guy up real quick. And we're going to click this verify button, and I'm going to show you. So it's like all this, SHA25some.txt. What in the world's all this going on? We have a GBG key. We have an integrity check. And then there's like, I glossed over. Okay, let me make this simple for you. What you need to do is you need to verify that the download matches this key. So we have the LMDE6 Cinnamon 64-bit ISO. We need to do a checksum against what is called an SHA256 hashtag check. And we want it to match this guy here. I went ahead and went to the GitHub page on their releases. And over here, I know exactly what I'm getting. So W64, this is Windows 64. Now we have an installer, which is an exe installer, or you might find an MSI installer on Windows. That is going to install the thing system-wide. It's going to appear in your start menu and all that. Where possible, however, I like standalone applications. These do not embed themselves inside of your operating system. You can run them from a USB drive, and it does make a lot more safe of a deployment. So we're going to go ahead and download this. Now we are going to need one more application, and since this is going to take some time to download, we'll go ahead and look for that one. And that one is going to be Etcher. And if I remember how to spell Etcher right, what we're going to do now, this one, warning, is one of the applications that did get itself showed up in one of those malvertising campaigns. Now this is a etcher.download. I'm not sure I'd go with that one necessarily. Is it Bellina-io/Etcher? This is the company that makes it. So this site here, Etcher.Bellina.io, is going to be the official site. Do not download it from anywhere other than this. Download.com. Nope, could be malware. .xyz, definitely malware. So let's go ahead and download this guy, and let's reject all cookies. And over here we have Etcher for Windows, we have Etcher for Mac, we have Etcher for Linux, and then over here we have the installer, we have a portable. And this bottom one down here is portable for 32-bit. Since our Windows is 64-bit and I prefer portable software, I'm going to download this one. So, that's going to take longer to install. So that's 6 minutes to download. I have a slow internet connection where we're recording this, so pardon me for that. So let's go ahead and have a look at what we have. Now, as I said, I had already come up here and I have already downloaded the distribution. If I click this, it's going to download our Debian LMDE file, and that is already over here in my downloads. So you can see LMDE6-Cinnamon 64-bit. Now, this is our standalone application we just downloaded. Let's go ahead and extract this guy here. Let's go ahead and hit the extract all. So you'll notice that is a compressed zip file. So we'll go ahead and let this guy do its extraction thing. And then this is going to be your easiest, simple way to check the hash and make sure that the hash matches what we need. Well, that's downloading. Let's go ahead and copy this guy into our clipboard because we can compare it with the software. So again, there's a bunch of these. This is version 4, this is version 5, this is version 6, this is 32, this is 64. Since we have the LMDE6 Cinnamon 64, this is the one that we want. So let's go ahead and have a look. Our software is just about downloaded. So let's go over to here. Oop. This isn't a complaint on Windows. This is just me being incompetent with running Windows systems. This is me. This is me. And the fact that I hate pinning things. This is why I hate this pinning crap. All right. let me just go back into our downloads, and we need to go into our standalone. This is the file folder. And then, okay, so it was loading us up. So now what we're going to do is we're going to hit this application, and then Windows is likely going to get me a scary, whoa, scary, we have protected you from your own freedoms. Oh, Windows protected your PC in an unrecognized app. Hit the more info, hit run anyway. GTK hash is a reputable software package. So let's go ahead and do this. We're going to go in, grab our file again, and we're going to go ahead and hash it. And we're going to be checking that against this over here. So here's your GTK hash, and you'll notice now the file appears to be correct. So you can see our file is now properly hashed. Now that we have that file properly hashed, we can proceed with the next step, which is going to be using Etcher. So we have downloaded that. Let's go back to our downloads folder, and here is our Etcher. So if we double click this application, it's probably going to give us a scary warning once again. And as I do this, what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to plug in a flash drive that we're going to use with Etcher. Oh, it did not give me a scary warning thing. All right, I'm going to remove my internet, disconnect our internet, because I don't have an extra available standard USB port easily available if I want my mouse. So we'll just go ahead and click this. So here we're going to, what this is, application is going to do is this is what takes the downloaded file, which is the ISO file, and then this is going to install it onto a USB drive in a format that will allow the system to boot. It's not just taking this file and putting it on the drive. You have to burn it to the drive in such a way that the drive can then boot. So we're going to hit flash from a file. I love how Windows automatically defaults to OneDrive. Use our crap. No. So here we're going to select our LMDE6 Cinnamon. We're going to open this up. We're going to select our target. It should only show you the drives available that are like USB drives. You'll notice there's the hidden drive. Don't do that. That is your system drive. So you see it's system drive. It's a secure drive. So we don't want to do that. So we're using the PNY USB 2.0. Ideally, you should do this with a 3.0 drive, but I don't have a 3.0 drive handy that I can use right this second. So we'll go ahead and start the burning process. And then it wants us to allow this application. So we can show more details if you want. There might be information there. We're going to say, yes, I'm going to allow this to make these changes. So this could take, depending on the speed of the computer and the speed of the drive, it could take, a minute or two. It could take, 10, 15 minutes. So since this is burning it onto a USB 2 drive, it might take a little bit longer. So I'm just going to go ahead and wait for this to finish. And then I'm going to be back once that is done. So we're powering on the main computer now, and I'm going to go ahead and spam the F11 key, which on this particular motherboard gets us to the one-time boot menu. And depending on your manufacturer, it could be the F9, the F11, or F12 key. So here is what that looks like. So what we have here is we have our Fedora, which is our SDA1. This is the disk that I'm just going to assume this is the disk that we don't want to touch. This is just a legacy BIOS on that same disk. And here is the actual drive we're going to boot out of, which is MX Linux. And then here we have just two more entries for that particular drive. This one that we're on now is the legacy. These are the UEFI, obviously. And this is the USB drive. Now, the first step you want to do is jump into your setup, and you're going to need to make some BIOS changes. Now, I have a Gaming Plus board here. It's going to be a little different for you. You're going to have to do a little bit of research. It's not hard, not complicated. Most of these menus are extraordinarily self-explanatory, but we want to look at just a couple of settings if you're wanting to play around with this. The first thing I might recommend you do is move around your boot orders a little bit. If you were to take like this USB U and move this to the very first boot priority, then what will happen is whenever you plug the USB drive in and power on the computer, it's going to boot from the USB drive. But if the USB drive is missing, it will boot from the first hard drive instead. This way, you don't ever have to mess with any of the BIOS menus or the one-time boot menus if you want to run your Linux. You just plug your device in, and then you will go ahead and boot into Linux. You unplug it, and you won't. Now, I generally keep mine just the way it is. It doesn't really matter. I actually use my Icy dock to hot remove the hard drives. So for me, it doesn't really matter. And I'm generally inclined to use the one-time boot menu if I need to do something. So that's what I like to do. The other thing you're going to need to find is you might need to find, usually under your security, that's your trusting computing, that's your TPM. That probably isn't going to be it. So under your trusted computing, your security device support, this would be like your secure boot. It's probably going to be called secure boot on yours. You're going to need to find that, and you might need to disable that. I keep it disabled on mine. Of course, I don't have any TPM devices. It's okay if you don't have any TPM devices. That's perfectly fine. So what we're going to do is we're going to save. If you've made any changes, in this case, it looks like I did swap the order of the USB drive and the CD key. That's perfectly fine. I'm okay with that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to hit that F11 key because I want to target to boot from the MX Linux instead of the Fedora Linux. Now remember, we're keeping the Fedora in there. Ideally, if you can, it is always better if you remove that hard drive. Okay? You want to remove that hard drive if you can, because it's going to risk something going wrong if you do a setup install wrong, and you want to keep that around. But in the event you can't, we're going to get into our boot here, and this is why we're using MX Linux. I would love to use Linux Mint instead. Unfortunately, Linux Mint installer has a little bug in it where it will not preserve your first drive no matter what you select, whereas MX Linux does work properly. So MX Linux is also one of my recommended Linux distributions. It's a very lightweight XFCE based distribution based on Debian with a lot of extra tools that makes it really easy for a new user. So what we're going to do here is let's get in here and we'll get ourselves all set up. And here is what I see. It looks like we're running at a screen resolution at, I think, 720p. That's because of my capture card here, since we're doing this all on real hardware. So I am going to go ahead and pull up the disks so you can just kind of see what's going on. We'll have a look at our disk manager. And on MX Linux, the default password is demo. Now, what you'll see when we plug this guy in, we see SDA. And I don't see SDB, which is our main operating system that we're running off of. I'm going to go ahead and plug in another drive right now. So I just plugged in another drive, and let's go ahead and reboot the disk manager. Maybe the disk manager is not showing us all the disks. It's kind of why I like the GNOME disks a little bit better. It will show us absolutely everything. Yeah, it's only showing us the SDA drive. It's not showing us all of the other devices. So kind of useless for what we're looking at. You can see over here we have our Fedora. This is our SDA. This is our main disk. This is the USB stick we just plugged in. You'll see that that's SDC. If we hover over this, you'll see this is SDA. And our file system is the one we're currently using. This is, in theory, going to be SDB. Okay, you're going to want to keep track of those. Now, you won't see that B show up anywhere because that's the operating system we are running on. So let's go ahead and click our installer. I think MX Linux is a single click by default. I double click that, but let's go ahead and run the installation process here. So it's going to check the installation. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the setup. Now, this is the part that you have to be the most careful on. We're going to hit our regular install using the entire disk. Now, this is SDA. This is the drive we do not want touched. This is the drive we're currently using. this is the drive with our target system. This is where we want to install it. Now, fortunately, MX Linux will install the bootloader and everything onto whatever drive we select here. So we're going to select SDC. We can encrypt this or not. If you're doing any production with this, particularly on a USB key, you probably want to encrypt it. I'm not going to do that here in this instance. So now it's going to give us a warning. If we push the start button, everything on SDC is destroyed. So we're going to go ahead and do this. And you can see it's formatting the drive. And now we need to go ahead and walk through everything. So do we want to be able to enable networking? Yes. Do we want to configure the time clock? Everything is already pretty much set up. There are these advanced server settings. So these are extra tools that you have. So Bluetooth. Do you want rsync file copying? Do you want printer services? Okay, we're turning off printing services. I don't need to print from this thing. Here's tools for various hardware. CPU frequency balances. You know, just all the different things. Scanner daemon. Okay, I don't need scanners either. Let's go ahead and turn those off. So we'll go ahead and hit OK. And then we hit next. Notice it's still copying the system. Now we're going to go ahead and give it our name. So let's go ahead and it's going to give it my default name there. And then we're going to go ahead and give it a password. I'll give this a production password here. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And then we can set a separate root administrative account, or you can leave that unchecked, in which case you will have sudo privileges. And if you want to had made any changes, you can save those changes over there. Go ahead and hit next. And now we're just going to wait for the system to finish copying files and complete its installation. So depending on your USB drive, we're using a 3.2 drive, which is the better USB drives, but they are still significantly slower than, for example, a USB external hard drive. So as we said in the introduction, it's better if you have one of those, but we're just doing it this way just because it only costs like $10 to do it this way to test out Linux. So because it's a USB drive a little bit slower, it could take up to an hour to install, depending on what's going on. So we'll go ahead and pause here and we'll come back when this is done, and then we will verify that everything boots and that our first hard drive has not been impacted at all. Installation is complete, and now what we're going to do is boot the computer back up, and we're going to have a look at the boot up menu there, and we'll see that Fedora is still there in perfectly working order, and we'll also see that we have the UEFI there, which we have two of these. Both of these will take us to the same spot. This is just calling the disk. This is calling the first partition on a disk. Both of those will take us to our new MX Linux. This is the legacy version of the boot. Of course, our CD drive is still there. Let me just show you first and foremost that Fedora still works just fine. So this is Grub on Fedora. And you'll see that it actually doesn't have any extra menus, which means it wasn't touched. And I didn't see anything in the installation logs that suggested it had been touched either. So let's go ahead and boot up Fedora just to show you that that is working. So we get logged on in here. So this just tells us that the first drive wasn't altered. So if this were a Windows drive, this would be untouched by what we did, just again making sure that you are selecting the correct disk to install to. So as far as Fedora is concerned, or in your case Windows is concerned, it has never been touched. So we're right back where we need to be. Let's go ahead and shut down Fedora here, and then we're going to go back to our main boot menu. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull out the Fedora drive as soon as it turns off, and then we're going to reboot the system. Now we're rebooting the system. There's no Fedora disk in there at all. The only boot option there is in the computer is the USB drive that we just installed MX Linux to. And so it sees that as our only boot up option. And now we can go ahead and boot into it. Of course, alternatively, you could have gone back to that F11 as we saw on the previous screen and simply selected the PNY drive or the MX Linux option that was up there as well. You could have just as easily done that and booted right on into here. And now we have a system that you can try Linux without having to change anything on your computer. Now, since it is running on a USB drive, it is going to be a little bit slower than a regular installed. So as I said in the introduction, if you can install it on a external USB hard drive, it's going to work quite a bit better than the USB drives. But the USB drives will give you a little bit of a flavor. It'll allow you to test things without spending a lot of money. Like I said, these drives are like $10. And if you can install Linux, play around with it without impacting your existing hard drive on your existing computer, then you'll actually get a chance to play around quite a bit. So I have entire videos that will show you about MX Linux, the various tools it has, the fun things you can do with it. I'm going to go ahead and link that video right to the end of this one. So if you're new to MX Linux, you can go ahead and watch that video going ahead. So with that, thanks guys for watching. And of course, you can subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Have a look at that introduction to MX Linux, particularly if you are new to MX Linux. You can see what all you can do. And hopefully that you have now learned how to build a Linux distribution without impacting your current install, so you can play around and see how it works. As you all know, my favorite Linux distribution is Linux Mint, and particularly Linux Mint Cinnamon. And originally I wanted to bring you this video in Linux Mint. There is, however, a couple of problems that I have observed. First and foremost, I have played around with Linux distributions on flash drives for a long time. If you go back at the very beginning of this channel, where I was changing my desktop computer every month, all of those were done on simple USB flash drives, and they all worked beautifully. What I found, however, is the longer Linux has been around, the operating systems are getting a little bit bigger, and they're not running quite as well. Linux Mint Cinnamon does not run well on a USB drive. That is very unfortunate. And it might be the whole Cinnamon desktop itself. I don't know. I know Armbian running Cinnamon on the Raspberry Pi is quite laggy. However, MX Linux running Cinnamon on the Raspberry Pi is not particularly laggy. So there's something going on that might increase that. Now, there is one other factor that we had to consider, and that is the installation. There does appear to be a bug in the installation files for Linux Mint, and I tried Cinnamon and I tried XFCE just in case to see what would happen there, because I think XFCE would probably work better than Cinnamon on a USB drive. However, the Ubiquity installer on Linux Mint actually allows you to select which drive you're installing everything to, just like MX Linux. However, it always seems to run the bootloader on SDA, in other words, the first drive, which means if you're trying to run Linux Mint on a Windows computer without disabling the drive first, you might actually damage the bootloader for Windows. So you may not want to try that. And then, of course, the bootloader is not on the USB drive, so that drive will only be able to boot when paired with the other drive in that computer. So there were some problems with Linux Mint. We don't know if that's a bug in the installer or if that is intentional, how it's running. But regardless, I did want to try this with Linux Mint. I wanted to have this note because, as you know, I do a lot of things with Linux Mint on the channel, and it just didn't work in this video. And that is why, if you are going to try this and you do not have the capability of removing that first drive, do not use Linux Mint for this. It might mess up that first drive. So definitely go with the MX Linux, of course, in that situation. So with that, we are going to wrap this video up here. Have a look at this MX Linux overview video if you have not seen that one before, and we will see you guys next time.